Hi everyone, welcome back. In the previous parts, we looked at how to set up the workspace inside NotebookLM Tools. Things like managing notebooks, switching between accounts, adding sources, organizing them into folders, and keeping the source list clean. But once the sources are ready, the next question is, what can NotebookLM actually create from them? That's where Studio items come in. Studio items are the generated outputs from NotebookLM, like quizzes, flashcards, audio overviews, infographics, reports, slide decks, notes, videos, and more. And in this part, I'll show how NotebookLM Tools makes those outputs easier to generate, preview, study, organize, export, and manage directly from the extension. I'll also cover the podcast player, which brings audio overviews from multiple notebooks into one place, so they feel more like a real listening library instead of being scattered across different notebooks. So let's start from the notebook we were working on earlier, YouTube AI Video Ideas. I already cleaned up the sources here, so now I'll switch over to the Studio tab. And right now, this notebook doesn't have any studio items yet. That actually makes sense, because up to this point, I've mostly been preparing the input side, adding sources, organizing them, and making sure everything is ready to use. But studio items are the output side. They're what NotebookLM generates from those sources. So before I create something new here, let me quickly show what it looks like when a notebook already has studio items. Back on the notebook list, NotebookLM Tools can also show studio item stats directly from here. So even before opening a notebook, I can already get a quick idea of what kind of generated content it has. For example, this Marugoto notebook already has generated items like an infographic, a quiz, and multiple flashcard decks. Without the extension, I would usually need to open the notebook in NotebookLM and check the generated items manually. That's fine for one small notebook. But once I have many notebooks, these stats make it much easier to find the notebook that already has study materials or generated artifacts ready to use. So I'll open this Marugoto notebook to show how studio items look after they already exist. This is the Studio tab for this notebook. Here I can see that this notebook already has 19 studio items generated from its sources. And the badges at the top give me a quick breakdown of what types are available: videos, mind maps, infographics, slide decks, quizzes, and flashcards. So before opening anything, I already have a clear overview of what NotebookLM has created. That's the main difference here. Instead of going into NotebookLM and checking generated items one by one, NotebookLM Tools turns them into a more organized artifact list. From here, I can filter by type, search by title, check which sources each item came from, and open the items directly inside the extension. So this Studio tab feels more like an artifact library for the notebook. Each studio item also shows which sources it was generated from. For example, this grammar flashcard deck was created from 15 different sources. So I can immediately tell that this is a broader deck covering multiple lesson files. But this vocabulary lesson 2 deck was generated from only one source. That gives me useful context before opening the item. Without this kind of view, I would have to open the item or remember how I generated it. But here, I can quickly see whether an artifact came from one lesson, multiple PDFs, or the whole notebook. That makes the generated content easier to trust, organize, and reuse later. Once a notebook has a lot of studio items, filtering by type becomes really helpful. I can click all to see everything, or I can narrow the list down to one specific type. For example, I can click quizzes to only show quiz items. Then I can switch to flashcards if I only want to study flashcard decks. Without the extension, I would usually need to visually scan the NotebookLM interface and open the right generated item myself. But here, the filters make that much faster. So if I already know what I want to work with, I can get there in one click. There's also search for studio items. So if I'm looking for something specific, like a vocabulary deck or a grammar guide, I can search by title instead of scrolling through the whole list. This is especially useful in study notebooks, where I may have many lessons, flashcard decks, quizzes, or summaries with similar names. The more artifacts a notebook has, the more useful this becomes. Another really useful filter is the source filter. Here, I can search for a specific source file, for example, Lesson 2. Once I select A-3 KL2eng PDF, the Studio tab only shows artifacts that were generated using that source. And now I get this banner showing that I'm viewing 9 out of 19 artifacts connected to that selected source. This is where the extension becomes especially useful compared to working directly inside NotebookLM. If I only use NotebookLM and I want to find everything related to one PDF or lesson, I usually have to remember the item names or open things manually. But with this source filter, I can go straight from a source file to all the generated artifacts connected to it. For study workflows, that makes a huge difference. I can focus on one lesson at a time instead of reviewing the whole notebook at once. Now let's look at exporting and managing studio items. If I click the zip button while no filter is applied, NotebookLM Tools starts exporting all the studio items currently in this notebook. And while the export is running, I can see a progress bar at the top. So instead of clicking download and waiting without knowing what's happening, I can clearly see how many items are being exported and how far along the process is. That's useful when the notebook has a lot of generated content, because exporting everything can take a little time. But the export also respects filters. For example, I'll use the source filter and select this lesson to PDF. Now the Studio tab is only showing the artifacts connected to that specific source. And if I click zip again, it only exports the filtered results, not the entire notebook. So this is really useful when I only want to save the study materials for one specific lesson instead of downloading everything. Another option is selecting items manually. Here, I'll select these first two studio items. Once I select them, the toolbar changes and gives me actions for only the selected items. I can rename them, download just these selected artifacts, or remove them if I don't need them anymore. So there are basically 3 levels of control here. I can export everything, export only filtered items, or manually select specific studio items and act on just those. That makes the Studio tab much more flexible than downloading or managing generated items one by one. So far, we've looked at how to browse, filter, search, and export studio items. But the more interesting part is that many of these artifacts can be opened directly inside NotebookLM Tools. So instead of treating them as static generated files, I can actually interact with them. Let's start with the quiz. Now let's open the quiz. Instead of showing the quiz as plain text, NotebookLM Tools turns it into an interactive study mode. At the top, I can see this quiz has 10 questions. I'm currently in study mode, so I can answer one question at a time. I'll choose an answer here, then click Check Answer. This is useful because I can check my answer before moving on. So I'm not just reading generated questions, I'm actually practicing with them. The quiz also supports navigation between questions, including keyboard navigation with arrow keys, which makes the study flow faster. After completing the quiz, the extension can calculate the score and let me review the options again. So the difference here is interaction. NotebookLM gives me the generated content. NotebookLM Tools turns that content into a more structured practice session. Next, let's open a flashcard deck. This deck has 65 flashcards. In study mode, I can go through the cards one by one. The front of the card shows the prompt, and I can flip it to reveal the answer. At the bottom, I can see the keyboard shortcuts too. Space flips the card, and the arrow keys move between cards. There's also a shuffle option, which is useful when I don't want to study in the original order. This is much smoother than just reading flashcards as generated text. With the extension, the flashcards behave more like an actual flashcard deck. So I can study with them instead of only viewing them. If I don't want to study card by card, I can switch to list mode. Here, I can see all flashcards in a scrollable list. The answers are hidden by default, so I can still test myself while reviewing. I can click one card to reveal its answer. Or I can use Reveal All if I want to review everything quickly. This is useful when I want a faster overview of the whole deck instead of a full study session. Flashcards can also be exported as CSV, so if I want to reuse this deck somewhere else, I can download it directly. For example, I could open it in a spreadsheet, import it into another study tool, or keep it as a backup. That makes the generated study material more portable instead of keeping it only inside this notebook. One more thing I can do with flashcards is open them in full screen mode. I can click the full screen icon here, and now the flashcard takes up almost the entire screen. This makes the study experience much cleaner, because I can focus on the card without the rest of the notebook interface around it. The keyboard shortcuts still work here too. I can use space to flip the card and the arrow keys to move between cards. When I'm done, I can press Escape to exit full screen. So for longer study sessions, this makes the flashcards feel much closer to a dedicated flashcard app instead of just a small modal inside the notebook. Next, let's open the infographic. Infographics are useful when I want a more visual summary of the notebook content. Instead of reading a full report, I can quickly review the main points in a more compact visual format. For a study notebook like this, that could be a grammar overview, a lesson summary, or a quick review sheet before studying. So the Studio tab is not just storing generated items. I can actually open and use those items directly from the extension. After viewing and studying the artifacts, the next step is keeping them organized. Studio items can also be managed like sources. For example, if a generated item has a title that is too general, I can rename it. Here, I'll rename this quiz into something clearer, like N5 Grammar Practice Quiz. That way, when I come back later, I know exactly what this item is for without opening it first. This is especially helpful when a notebook has many generated quizzes, decks, notes, or summaries. After renaming one item, the same idea also works in bulk. Because if I have several generated items that belong to the same lesson or study level, I probably don't want to rename them one by one. So here, I'll select a few flashcard artifacts and click Rename. This opens the bulk rename window. Just like with source renaming earlier, I have a few different methods. Replace text is useful when multiple artifact names share the same repeated phrase, and I want to clean it up. Add text lets me add extra text before or after the current name. And custom is useful when I want to fully restructure the selected names into a new format. For this example, I'll use add text. I'll add N5 before the name because these flashcards are part of my N5 study workflow. Before applying anything, I can preview the changes here. So I can see exactly how each artifact name will look before I confirm it. Once everything looks good, I'll click Apply All. And now those selected studio items have cleaner names that are easier to recognize later. This is useful when I have multiple quizzes, flashcards, notes, or summaries, and I want them to follow the same naming style. Now that we've seen what existing studio items look like, let's go back to the YouTube notebook and look at the generation workflow. This notebook already has sources prepared, but it doesn't have any studio items yet. So from here, I can click Generate and create new outputs from the sources in this notebook. Inside the Generate modal, I can choose what type of studio item I want to create. There are several options here: audio, quiz, flashcards, report, slide deck, data table, mind map, video, and infographic. I can choose just one type or select multiple types at the same time. For example, I can generate an audio overview, a quiz, flashcards, and an infographic from the same notebook in one workflow. That's useful because I don't have to generate every artifact one by one. After choosing the artifact types, I can choose which sources should be used. This source selection applies to all the studio items I'm generating in this batch. So if I select these 5 sources, then the audio, quiz, flashcards, and infographic will all be generated based on the same selected sources. That keeps the batch consistent because all the outputs are using the same context. Then, under each artifact type, I can customize the settings for that specific output. For example, for audio, I can choose the format and length. For quiz, I can choose the quantity and difficulty. For flashcards, I can also choose quantity and difficulty. And for infographic, I can adjust things like orientation, detail level, and style. So the sources are shared across the whole generation batch, but each output type still has its own settings. That's the important distinction here. After that, I can choose the output language and add optional instructions if I want to guide the result more specifically. For this demo, I'll keep it in English because this notebook is for a YouTube tutorial workflow. Then in the instruction box, I can add a more specific direction for the generated items. For example, I'll write, "Focus on YouTube content planning and practical tutorial ideas." This way, the generated outputs are not just generic summaries. They're more aligned with what I actually want to create from this notebook. So once the sources, settings, language, and instructions are ready, I can click Generate 4 types to start generating all selected studio items in one batch. Once I click Generate, NotebookLM Tools starts creating all selected studio items from the same selected sources. So in this case, it's not just generating one output. It's creating multiple formats from the same context: an audio overview, a quiz, flashcards, and an infographic. This is useful because different formats serve different purposes. The audio is good for listening and reviewing passively. The quiz and flashcards are better for active recall. And the infographic gives me a quick visual summary. So instead of thinking of studio items as separate random outputs, I like to think of them as different ways to reuse the same source material. One set of sources can become something to listen to, something to study with, and something to visually review. Now the new studio items have been created and added to the Studio tab. I can see them here in the list, with their type badges and creation time. So let me quickly open a few of them. I won't go too deep here because we already looked at viewers earlier, but this shows the full flow. Start with Organize Sources, choose what I want to generate, customize the settings, and then open the generated outputs directly inside the extension. That's what makes this workflow feel connected from start to finish. Now, that's the workflow when I'm already inside a notebook. But sometimes I find useful content before I even open NotebookLM Tools. For example, I might be reading an article online and immediately think, this would be useful as a quiz, flashcards, or an audio overview. In that case, I don't have to add the page first, then come back later to generate studio items. I can start that process directly from the extension pop-up. So let me show that workflow. Here, I'm reading this Google article about AI and learning. Since I already know this article could be useful for my notebook, I can open the extension pop-up right from this page. The pop-up automatically detects the current page, including the title and URL. And here, I also have this Also Generate Studio section. This lets me add the article as a source and choose the studio outputs I want to generate at the same time. For this example, I'll select a few output types, like report, slide deck, mind map, and video. So I'm not just saving the article. I'm also telling NotebookLM Tools what I want NotebookLM to create from it right away. Now I'll choose Add to Existing Notebook and select the YouTube AI Video Ideas notebook. Once I confirm, the article is added to that notebook and the selected studio items start generating from it. And here, I can see the pop-up confirms that the article was added successfully and the 4 selected types are complete. Now, when I go back to the YouTube AI Video Ideas notebook and open the Studio tab, I can see the new items that were created from that pop-up workflow. Some items are already ready, and some may still be processing depending on the type. For example, I can see a report, a video, a slide deck, and a mind map connected to that article. So this is a really useful shortcut. If I find an article while browsing, I can send it into NotebookLM and generate usable outputs immediately without manually switching back and forth between the article, the notebook, and the Studio tab. And this is especially helpful for research or content planning workflows. If I'm collecting sources for a video, a class, or a study project, I can turn a single article into different formats right away. A report for reading, a slide deck for presentation, a mind map for structure, and a video or audio style output for review. So the pop-up workflow is basically a faster path from I found something useful to I already have generated materials from it. Now, most studio items live inside individual notebooks, but audio overviews are a little different. Because once I start generating audio across multiple notebooks, I probably don't want to open each notebook one by one just to find something to listen to. That's why NotebookLM Tools also has a dedicated podcast player. It brings audio overviews from different notebooks into one place, so I can listen to them more like a podcast library. To start, I can scan my notebooks for audio overviews. At the top, I can choose how many notebooks I want to scan. For example, I can scan the last 10 notebooks, the last 20 notebooks, or a larger range depending on how much audio I want to collect. For this demo, I'll scan the recent notebooks. Once I click Scan, the extension goes through those notebooks and looks for available audio overviews. While it's scanning, I can see the progress here, so I know it's actively checking notebooks in the background. And after the scan finishes, the list updates automatically. Now I can see the new audio overview from the YouTube AI Video Ideas notebook showing up in the podcast player. So instead of manually opening each notebook to check if it has audio, I can collect everything from here. The audio overviews are grouped by notebook, so I can still tell where each episode came from. Here, I can see an audio overview from the YouTube AI Video Ideas notebook, and below that, audio from other notebooks. Each row has a play button, the audio title, the duration, and download options. And each notebook group also has a zip option and a NotebookLM link, so the audio is still connected back to its original notebook. This makes the podcast player feel more like a central audio hub, instead of having audio scattered across separate notebook pages. Now I'll play this audio overview from the YouTube AI Video Ideas notebook. Once it starts playing, the Now Playing bar appears at the bottom, so I can control the audio without leaving the list. From here I can play or pause, jump back 10 seconds, jump forward 30 seconds, adjust the volume, and see the listening progress. The player also remembers progress, so if I stop and come back later, I can continue from where I left off. There are keyboard shortcuts too, space for play or pause, arrow keys for skipping and volume, and M to mute. And if I want to review faster, I can change the playback speed, like switching from 1x to 1.25x. So overall, this gives audio overviews a much more complete listening experience than just opening them one by one inside individual notebooks. The podcast player also gives me a few different download options depending on how much audio I want to save. If I want to download all audio from one notebook group, I can use the zip button here. That keeps the episodes from the same notebook together, which is useful if I want to archive one project, one class, or one research topic. But if I only need one specific episode, I can use the download icon on that audio row instead. So I don't have to download the whole group just to save one audio overview. And if I want to back up everything that was found in the current scan, I can use Download All at the top. So the download options are pretty flexible. One notebook group, one single audio, or everything currently detected in the podcast player. And if I want to go back to the original notebook, I can click the NotebookLM button here. This opens the notebook where that audio overview came from. So the podcast player is not separated from the rest of the workflow. I can listen from this central audio library, but still jump back to the notebook whenever I want to check the sources, open other studio items, or continue working with that project. So that wraps up the studio items and podcast player section. In this part, we looked at how NotebookLM Tools helps me work with the outputs that NotebookLM creates from my sources. Inside the Studio tab, I can generate artifacts, filter them by type, search by title, filter by source, open quizzes, study flashcards, view infographics, export items, rename them, and manage them as the notebook grows. And with the podcast player, audio overviews become much easier to use across multiple notebooks. I can scan for audio, play episodes, track progress, change playback speed, download one episode, export a notebook group, download everything, and jump back to the original notebook when I need more context. So the full workflow goes from organized sources to generated studio items to actually using those outputs in a cleaner and more flexible way. And that's what makes NotebookLM Tools feel much more complete than just a basic notebook manager. But as the number of notebooks grows, another problem starts to show up. Folders help me organize sources inside one notebook. But what if I want to organize notebooks across the whole workspace by topic, project, class, workflow, or purpose? That's where tags come in. So in the next part, I'll go through the tag system in NotebookLM Tools, how to create tags, assign them to notebooks, filter notebooks by tags, manage tag colors, and use tags to keep the whole NotebookLM workspace organized. And if there's any part of NotebookLM Tools you want me to cover more deeply, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next part.